Okay, good morning, everyone. Let's get started for the day. We are now going to launch right into the discussion of energy and fossil fuels, nuclear, renewable, right? So we're on a pretty fast train here to wrapping up this first third of the course, but we have to get through energy. And as I made the point, I think on Thursday, this is obviously tied very closely into population, but there are many other environmental issues that fall out from our discussion of energy, right? Air quality is of course one of them. So I posed this as one of the two questions last week, and it's really most relevant to today and what we'll tackle on Thursday, which is really our dependence on fossil fuels and the fact that that dependence is going to be here for some time to come. So let's start here. We look at this. This is the current state, if you like, of where we get our energy from. And so here I'm talking about energy in its broadest sense, right? I'll make some very specific distinctions between energy and electricity. But if you look at where we get our energy from as a globe, you can see that 85% of our current energy is supplied to us from fossil fuels. So there's a kind of harsh reality here, right? That's why I think it's very important to be, to have, this is my opinion, to have lofty goals of decarbonizing our energy future and living sustainably and all these things, which are undoubtedly important and clearly what this course is about. But there's also a reality, and the reality is that is just simply not going to happen overnight. When 85% of our energy comes from fossil fuels, we're obviously going to be committed to that for some time to come. Okay, you can see that oil is still an enormous player here, right? A third of all our energy comes to us from oil, and obviously that is dominated by transportation fuels. Coal 27%, natural gas, and you can see the rest. And one of the questions that we will examine, one of several questions we will examine, is how large can this green slice become, renewable? So when we think of wind, solar, biomass, and other renewable technologies, truly renewable, how big can that green pie get by 2050 and by 2100? Right, so that's as a starting point. All right, let's spend a little bit of time. And so what I'm going to do for a while here, everybody, I want to give you context before we talk about coal, natural gas, oil, and the individual generation technologies. Right, so let's look at context here for a little bit. So here's one way of looking at context. These are the proven oil reserves in billions of barrels. Right, you can see countries along the bottom here. On the y-axis is proven reserves in billions of barrels, right? So that's this axis over here, how many billions of barrels. And that's what these vertical histograms are. They refer to the left-hand axis. And these numbers here refer to the right-hand axis. So in other words, Venezuela has, we think, about 17 to 18% of the proven oil reserves in the world. And the other thing I've done here is I've included three countries here, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran, and also the United States. And I've scaled those countries relative to one another, right? So let me just stop there and get you folks starting to think, okay? What's up with this diagram? What about this diagram surprises you? What are perhaps some critical implications of this diagram? Just as a context, what comes to mind when you see this?
I often think about like why American troops are over in Iraq and Iran.
Okay, so let's launch right into the controversy here, Holly. Let's not hold back. Good for you. Yeah. Okay. So when you look at Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran, right, and that's not just to single out those three countries, but they're very important strategically from an oil perspective. Okay, it raises questions. It raises questions about supply. It raises questions about our imports. It raises questions about global security. Certainly raises questions about, did we really go into Iraq to spread democracy? Would we have gone in if there was no oil, right? There is and I'm not trying to make a political statement, right? But to your point, Holly, there are a lot of geopolitical questions that come to mind when you look at this map. So that's a great start. What else? What else do you see?
Like the difference between from Canada to Saudi Arabia is quite large, but as we like go back, you go from like 9 to 6 to 3, essentially. Like if in terms of groupings.
So just rephrase that quickly, Gavin. You're saying
So from Canada to Saudi Arabia, there's a very large difference. And as we kind of go back from Canada, you go to like Russia, and that's where you can see kind of like a grouping of like somewhere around 9, somewhere around 6, somewhere around 3. There's kind of a decline by 3.
I find it interesting how Venezuela has the most.
Okay, Janira. So why do you think that is? I mean, doesn't that surprise you? Venezuela and Saudi Arabia are essentially equal in terms of proven reserves.
Yeah, it's funny because like how Holly made a point that like we're always in the Middle East trying to find oil, but like I never hear in the news about us going to Venezuela to dig up for oil.
Now there's an interesting twist to Venezuela, right? And to Canada, but Venezuela. When you look at Venezuela's 300 billion barrels of oil, those aren't sitting in a traditional big pool of oil underground that we can just stick a straw in, suck it out, and ship it around the world, right? Venezuela's proven reserves are very problematic. Anybody know why?
Aren't they like in sands and it's really hard to extract?
Perfect, right? So Venezuela's proven reserves are oil sands, right? This is oil that are very difficult and expensive to extract because they haven't developed somewhere and migrated into a reservoir. They are sitting in tiny, tiny little pore spaces attached to sand particles. And we'll talk about that, right? So Venezuela has an enormous proven reserves in what is known as the Orinoco Formation. It's what is known as heavy crude, okay? So we'll mention that. Expensive to get out, expensive to move around the world, okay? So that's one point. Saudi Arabia. So Venezuela's resources are what we call unconventional. That's an important term, unconventional, versus conventional resources, which are largely what Saudi Arabia's are, okay? Question from Shardy, would that 17.5 be lower if they were easier and cheaper to extract? So that's an excellent question. Why did you ask that? That's a great question. The answer is yes, they would be, right? Great question. If Venezuela's 300 billion barrels were sitting in an easily accessible formation, they would be an enormous player on the world market, okay? There's another geopolitical fingerprint here. Venezuela is ruled by Nicolas Maduro. That's problematic, right? We're not talking about one of the world's great democracies at the moment. There is such a thick political layer to all of this. Canada's reserves as well. Most of those, as you'll see in a second, are oil sands, right? And there's an enormous disparity to who has oil and who does not have oil, okay? And this has really run the global markets for decades and still does, but is likely to change, right? Okay, so that's just a picture of where the oil is. Where do you think we in the United States get most of our oil from?
In Alaska.
Okay, Josiah, Alaska? No. It's a bit of a loaded question. We get some from Alaska.
Wasn't it most recently like West Texas though? Like when President Trump was in office, he made Texas the largest producer of oil.
So Texas is the largest producer of U.S. Crude oil. That is correct, right? And in terms of importing oil, Where do you think? Ah, I've got Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Canada. Yeah, it's really fascinating, right? Oil is such an interesting, it's an important, but it's such an interesting commodity. Just look at this. These are the 5 largest sources of US petroleum imports. Now, I need to make a quick distinction here, everybody. I don't mean to use petroleum and crude oil interchangeably, right? People often do, right? Crude oil is what it is. It is the crude bitumen, the oil that we get out of the ground, right? The stuff that we're pumping out of the ground, that's crude oil. That then gets refined into a variety of petroleum products, if that makes sense, right? And those petroleum products would be things like jet fuel and gasoline and petroleum products, plastics, things that you use in everyday life. But when we think of where the US imports its oil from, 43% of that comes from Canada, right? Now, that does not mean that 43% of all of our oil comes from Canada, because we, as you'll see in just a second, we are a gigantic producer of oil. This is just in terms of imports, okay? So Canada, there's Canada's 167, 170 billion barrels. You can see that the vast majority of that, and I've tried to capture that here in just a simple little infographic. The majority of Canada's oil is in oil sands. That's something we're going to examine in just a little bit, right? And a small amount of that is conventional oil. So these oil sands are enormously problematic. So Canada has a huge reserve of oil. And the question I'll pose, I don't necessarily want an answer because it's something we're going to explore, is should we be going after that oil, right? I find this fascinating. A lot of people think that we get the majority of our oil imports from Saudi Arabia. We used to get much more from Saudi Arabia. Now we get less than 9%. Any other questions or just thoughts on that? Okay. Okay, cool. Let's move on. All right, so that's just a little bit of context. Again, this is the global challenge. One of the other global challenges when it comes to energy is that we've got 7.8 billion people on the planet. As we all know, we're going to probably get another 2 billion, right? And presumably those 2 billion are going to want energy, right? They're going to want electricity. So this is an estimate that about 1.5 billion people on the planet don't have electricity. The efficient and predictable and affordable flow of electricity is the fundamental foundation of societal development, industrial development, right? If you don't have electricity, you've got a problem, okay? So this is an issue that is going to have to be addressed. And one of the themes in this course, for sure, and especially here in energy, everybody, is this theme of who has what, right? And what is their impact? So let me walk you through this. This is a really cool website called Dollar Street. And if you're interested, you can certainly Google Dollar Street. And it's really neat because you can go and visit a number of families around the world. These are real families. And people have gone in and they get to know them and they get to look at where they are on a socioeconomic spectrum. So here's just 3 families. And I'm using this just to illustrate this point about uneven access to things. So here's the Batoi family in Burundi in Africa, all right? This is Imelda, she's 41, she has 4 children. They own this house. They've been living there for 5 years. They live on the equivalent of $27 a month, right? Favorite items are their cattle and their clothes. $27 a month, okay? This is the Lagarde family in the Philippines. Joel works as an airport staffer. His wife, Judith, is a school service operator. They are parents to 4 children. They rent a room. The next big thing they plan on is buying a car. Their dream one day is to be able to buy a house. And they live on $865 a month. See, here's the Larrière family in France, right? They're struggling by on $19,671 a month. They're retired, live in a 3-bedroom house. Their favorite items are their artwork collection, and their next big thing is to try and buy a chalet in Switzerland. Some of these things are not like the others, right? And I'm not showing you this to make any judgment call on anything other than to illustrate the point that the Laurier family probably have electricity, okay? The Lagarde family do. The Betoya family do not, okay? And so there is this enormous disparity in the buying power and the ecologic footprint and the economic footprint and what this means to get 1.5 billion people electricity and food and water and all of the things that we're still going to talk about in this course, okay? It's a cool website. Here's another way to contextualize this, okay? As it pertains specifically to energy, and then we'll begin to wrap up the context. In 2010, we went through 7 billion people right at the end of 2010. So that's why I've started this diagram here, and I've taken this data and made these infographics from a really cool TED talk. This is not my concept. In 2010, there were 7 billion people in the world, and they were more or less distributed along this spectrum. 2 billion people lived on less than $2 a day, right? $1.90, incidentally, is the poverty line according to the World Bank. So $2 a day, 2 billion people lived on less than $2 a day. And they each used half of these little bricks of energy, right? Each one of these sort of rectangles represents a unit of energy. And instead of expressing this in actual billions of barrels of oil, we've done this by saying in 2010, the world consumed 12 units of energy, right? Globally, okay? Sorry, I should clarify, electricity. So there's 2 billion people living on less than $2 a day. They each use half a unit in terms of electricity equivalent, and they cook their food on fires and so on, right? There's 3 billion people that are living on between $2 and $40 a day, and they each consume 1 unit. Then there's about 1 billion people that are living on between $40 and $80 a day, and they are consuming about 2 units. They have things like washing machines. And then there's 1 billion people in 2010 that each consume half of the world's electricity production, right? 6 units. And they not only have washing machines, but they probably have cars and take vacations. It's a very broad contextualization for the planet in 2010, right? So what happens in 2050? Things don't stay the same. People develop, right? And it's very likely, I'll just go back a second, it's highly likely that the 1 billion people who have washing machines are going to develop to the point where they have cars and take vacations, right? Let's assume that they each consume 6 units of this energy/electricity portfolio. The 3 billion that have light bulbs move into the washing machine group, and they no longer consume 1 unit, they each consume 2. And the 2 billion that are living on less than $2 a day, let's assume the next 2 billion that come along, that 4 billion now have access to electricity, right? You see where this is going? Inevitably, as we add another 2 billion people to the planet, and as those people develop over time, we go from using 12 units to 22 units. The demand for energy is going to go up. There's no doubt about that. Now, will it be 22? Well, let's say we take 4 of these units off the board just by efficiency, right? More efficient appliances, carbon sequestration, we just become much more efficient at using electricity. The estimates are that by 2050, we'll be using about 18 of these bricks and not 12, right? So that's still a 50% increase in the demand for energy. The question that really this course is focused on is how many of these energy blocks can we turn green, right? Quote unquote green. What is the reality of taking that 50% demand or increase in energy and converting that away from fossil fuels? Can it be 9 and 9? In other words, can we get half of our electricity and energy requirements from green technologies like wind and solar? Or is it going to be, sorry, we go back and it's just simply going to be 18 and that's all going to come from fossil fuels? So let me stop there and see if there are any comments or thoughts or questions on that. It's just a conceptualization on how society is evolving and what this might mean in terms of the demand for energy. See if that makes sense to everybody. Okay, cool. Let's wrap a little more specifics around this, okay? So here what you see is the projected growth in energy demand from 2010 again out to 2035, right? And what we're showing here, the y-axis here, the scale is not critical. It's just expressed as million tons of oil equivalent, right? It's just an expression on how much energy is required. What is key here is how this demand is changing geographically, right? So you can see the different colors here. The OECD, does anybody know what OECD stands for, the greens? That's the Organization of Economically Developed Countries, right? OECD. These are the kind of developed countries, the G20, if you like. Then we've got the rest of the world, the Middle East, Russia, India, and China. You can clearly see here that the demand through the next 20 to 25 years is being driven not solely from India and China, but to a large extent, right, from India and China, as these two countries grow and continue to develop. Here's another way of contextualizing this. This is the growth in energy consumption, right, in 2018, just looking at 2018. A third of all of the growth worldwide in 2018 came from China, okay? The US, 20% growth, India, 15%, and so on, right? So those three countries, China, the US, and India, as you'll see when we get a little deeper into the course, everyone, those three countries have to be leading when it comes to decarbonizing our energy future. If one of them opts out, we're in trouble, okay? So that's just to illustrate that this is not going away anytime soon. And when I say it, I mean the growth in the demand for energy. All right, that's setting the scene, okay? Let's look at electricity here. So this is electricity, okay? So we take our transportation fuels, crude oil. Let's just put that aside for the moment. This is 2019. I've updated some numbers here. So this is global electricity consumption. This is worldwide, right? Global electricity consumption. You can see that in 2019, almost 30% of our electricity worldwide was generated from natural gas, 22% from coal, 18% from nuclear. We've got hydro, wind, other, and solar, right? I don't know if that pie chart surprises anybody. I can tell you a decade ago, coal would have been over 30%, right? So globally, coal is on the way out and being reduced dramatically. Okay, so that's globally. Let's look at the United States. I'm going to show you a summary diagram here, and then I'm going to show you what I think is quite an interesting way to portray this. I haven't put this in the book, but I've taken it from a website, so you'll see. So let me show you what I'm going to try and keep things consistent. So I've kept it at 2018, and then I'll update these in another set of graphs in just a minute. So how have I portrayed this? Look here in the top left-hand corner. This is a very crude way to show you how the US has changed its consumption of electricity in terms of source from 2004 to 2018, right? In other words, in the US in 2004, we got our electricity, 51% of our electricity came from coal, 51 in the US in 2004. In 2018, that's 30, right? Everybody see that for the US as a whole, okay? Renewables in 2004, so renewables here are solar and wind predominantly, 3%. Now it's 10%, right? In the US as a whole. These other diagrams, I'm not ever going to ask you to, study these and give me these percentages in terms of memorization. But these other diagrams show you some states and how that electricity is distributed. Let me move on a slide here and show you some updated diagrams. I love the way this is shown, right? So this comes from the New York Times, and it's updated through to 2019. And it shows how the United States generated electricity. So this is 2001 in the bottom left here, right, to 2019. And I love the way this is displayed because it shows the percentages and how those percentages change over time. So just look at this for the US, right? Electricity in 2001, 51% from coal. At the end of 2019, 23% from coal. Natural gas, 17, 38, okay? What surprises you here? Anybody want to make a comment generally about the US?
Why did the hydroelectric energy go down over the years?
Okay, so that's a good question. It's just the way it's plotted. So let me just make sure you're oriented here. It's just the way it's plotted. Look at the percentages, Chanira. In 2001, hydro is 6%, and in 2019, it's 7%. Hydro hasn't gone down, it's just flipped. It's just the way it's being shown. It's just showing that wind and hydro are now the same. They could have put hydro and wind both at 7. Does that make sense, right? So
Okay,
when you
that
look at
makes sense.
2014, look at coal. Coal doesn't go through this dramatic 100% to 0%. It's just so they can show how it's plotted, where natural gas flips over and becomes more widespread than coal. Does that explain that, Janira?
Yes, it does. Thank
Okay,
you.
cool. Yeah. Courtney, very interesting switch from coal to natural gas. Yeah, fascinating, hey? This may sound like a political statement, and maybe it is, but I'm approaching this from an energy perspective, right? In 2016, President Trump said he was not just going to make America great again, and I'm just going to leave that there. He was going to make coal great again. And every presidential candidate prior to that, Democrat or Republican, would go into coal country, right? And say, okay, whilst we've got to switch from coal, we've got to keep coal on the, here's the bottom line to making coal great again. It ain't happening. It is simply not happening. And it's not a political thing. It's being driven by economics and the environment, right? It is cheaper to generate electricity from natural gas and from wind than from coal. And companies are doing it because it's cheaper, okay? Oh, and by the way, generating electricity from natural gas is much cleaner than from coal, right? Now, the people that I hang out with a lot, the kind of eco-hippie, greeny environmentalists, would hate that statement, right? They would say, what do you mean natural gas is twice as clean as coal? We got to get away from natural gas, and it's all got to be wind and solar. Well, look at the realities here. That's why I said there's a really harsh reality check here, everybody. We currently generate 7% of our electricity from wind and about 3% from solar. We are at about 10% wind and solar for the US as a whole. How do we wake up tomorrow and say, all right, we're going to cancel that. Yeah, we don't like coal, we're going to cancel that. No, I don't like nuclear, let's cancel that too, right? Let's just ramp up wind and solar to 100% tomorrow morning. Not going to happen, right? Technologically, and for all sorts of other reasons that we're going to explore, that's just simply not going to happen, right? So when it comes to the discussions of energy and the environment, we have to be really, really frank with you, we have to be honest about what we can do. Kevin, that's an interesting comment. At least it's a step in the right direction. Couldn't agree more, right? Absolutely, it's a step in the right direction. But there are some technological and some environmental and some economic challenges to do that, right? So interesting question here, Courtney. Is wind use increasing exponentially if we were to scroll ahead 50 years? 50 years, no. I mean, it's increasing rapidly, but there's a reality to wind, right? What's the reality to wind? Courtney, just stick on your mic if you can. Why can't we keep going at an exponential increase in wind, do you think?
It might not be windy.
Well, yeah, right, exactly. Okay. No, exactly. So wind and solar are renewable, right? And I get so frustrated when I talk to people about energy and they go, well, we can't go all solar because solar doesn't work at night. Well, no kidding. I mean, I think we know that. When the sun goes down, solar's tricky, right? Unless you somehow have storage, and we'll examine that when we get to solar. Same thing, when the wind doesn't blow, well, the turbines don't turn. Again, we know that, right? There is a physical limit to how much you can extract from renewables. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean you can't go 100% renewable. You've got to have storage. All right. So storage is the golden egg. So thanks for that. Thanks for that comment. What I want to do, so that's the US, right? Let's just pull out some interesting states here. So I don't have time to go through every state, right? So please don't take it personally if I don't put your state on here. But I will put in an email or on D2L, I'll put a link to the website where you can look at all of these, okay? All right, quick question from Kevin here. Do you think nuclear will increase in the next 30 years despite the decreases recently? No, I don't. I personally don't. And it's an economics thing. Some countries will and some countries won't, but I think nuclear is not going to grow substantially. And again, we're gonna, it's a good question, Kevin. We're gonna talk about nuclear specifically. So let's just look at some nuances here. Right? Here's Pennsylvania, right? Let's just look at Pennsylvania for a second, okay? 2001 to 2019. Pennsylvania has gone from 57% coal to 17% coal, right? That is extraordinary, okay, in a state like Pennsylvania, right? Natural gas has gone from less than 3 to 42, okay, just in Pennsylvania, right? Let's look at Iowa, right? Huh, you notice about Iowa, coal, 85% to 35. Anybody from Iowa? 42% of your electricity comes from wind. That's extraordinary, right? 42% in Iowa comes from wind. Natural gas is increasing, right? Hydro, very, very low. Okay, let's look at the great state of Nevada for a minute. Nevada, coal, 52%, 7%. I'm not a great financial person. I would not be investing in coal in Nevada, right? It's just not happening. It's on the way out. And natural gas has gone from 34 to 64. Now, I know this is geographical and economic. I'm going to tie in the environmental implications when we go through this individually, right? How long can natural gas last? A question from Sandy. A long, long time. It is finite, right? It's a non-renewable resource. There's plenty of it. I think the estimates, well, I'm always wary of estimates because we were supposed to run out of oil 10 years ago, or at least be on the downward slide. Natural gas would probably have 150 to 200 years. I think at least, Sandy, is the conventional wisdom. Right. I know there's some of you from California, so I cannot forget California, right? Here's California, right? Natural gas, 39. Look at solar in California, right? 20% of electricity comes from solar. That's incredible growth. Wind about 7, hydro about 18, okay? Coal in California, almost non-existent. Of course, we're going to come and do the greatest state of all. Texas, natural gas 51, natural gas 53. Interesting, right? Why do you think natural gas has been so consistent in Texas?
Isn't it because of the shale out here?
Yeah, someone mentioned the Permian earlier and the Barnett Shale underneath us. That's where the natural gas is. It's an unconventional reservoir, as I'm still going to examine, but this technique of hydraulic fracking, right? Fracturing the rock and getting the natural gas out, that was developed right underneath our feet here in the late 1980s. Okay, so natural gas has been steady. Again, look at coal in Texas, extraordinary, 36 to 19%. Wind has gone from this cute little niche way of generating electricity to 17% of our portfolio here in Texas. That's for the state as a whole, right? In November, on one day, 49% of our electricity came from wind in Texas, almost half of it, okay? So that's pretty extraordinary. Nuclear has stayed steady pretty much across the board in the United States. Solar is beginning to ramp up. So my point here, everybody, is there's some really interesting nuances when you look at different states and you wrap it up all together, you get that summary for the US. So let me stop there and see if there are any comments or thoughts before we start with coal. Yeah, Tamara.
Yes, so I saw that California, I think it was like a few months ago, they were switching to like all electric cars in the coming years. Is that going to lead to like a strain or like a stress on like solar energy or like natural gas?
Okay, so that's a really good question, right? this notion of going to electric cars, because again, you have to charge them. So where are you getting that charge from? And that's some of the criticism I get when people say, okay, you eco-environmentalist, you want electric cars. Guess what? You're charging it from coal. Okay, well, yeah, you're charging those from natural gas, but the key, right? The key to the electric vehicle market is not just simply charging your car on the current grid. The key is being able to charge that when the electricity is being generated by renewables, right? So that's a challenge, Janira, and you'll see I'll build that in a little later where I'll show you a curve that shows here's the energy demand, let's say California, right? You wake up, energy demand's high, and then it goes sort of steadies off, and then people come home and they turn on their air conditioning, and then they go to bed at night, and the electricity demand goes down, right? So when does the wind really blow? Well, it generally picks up at night. So you have to have a grid that is, I don't know if you've heard of this term, a smart grid, right? Where you can manage and maneuver the renewable technologies, or where during the day you're using natural gas to generate electricity, and possibly, if you've got solar, put it into batteries, and then at night you release the discharge from the batteries to charge the electric cars. It's very, very complicated, right? It's not just a one-to-one thing. It's managing a very dynamic system. Unfortunately, Chinera, and that's why it's such a good question, we're just not quite there yet, right? We still have a grid that Thomas Edison thought of, where you burn coal, you boil water, you create steam, and you pump it out along transmission lines into people's homes. Does that make sense? Good question. Josiah, did you have a question you were going to pose? You're on mute.
It's in the chat.
Say again?
Oh, it's in the chat.
Oh, it's in the chat. Okay. With the issue with gathering materials for storage, do you think there are any ethical alternatives to extracting minerals such as lithium? And a follow-on one to that, to Ashley's, aren't electric car batteries even worse for the environment too? Everything comes at a price, right? Lithium is not the future, right? Solid state storage is the future. Excuse me. And the car industry is leading the way, right? Because we're not going to transition to a truly decarbonized future if your Tesla can go 250 miles and that's it, right? So solid state batteries are. Oh, excuse me. So Ashley, your point's well taken, right? Lithium ions, yeah, you put it into a Tesla and it's great. I mean, what do you do with the batteries, right? And the cost of replacing the batteries down the line. We're going to look at that as well. We're going to examine all the ifs, ands, or buts. Any other questions on context? How are we doing on time? 12 minutes. All right. Okay. So let's pick them apart, right? Let's do the good, the bad, and the ugly. Let's talk a bit about coal, natural gas, oil, nuclear, and renewables. And I'm going to have to be very selective what I take here. Okay. Coal. Can we realistically abandon coal? Okay. The Cliff Notes answer is no, not in the short term, certainly not in the next several decades. Is it 2? Is it 3? Is it 4? Coal's going to be around for a while, right? So we know that coal drives the Industrial Revolution, okay? Prior to the Industrial Revolution, we get most of our energy from burning wood, biomass. We then invent the combustion engine and we figure out how to burn coal, break the carbon bonds, release heat to boil water. Coal, of course, is a non-renewable resource, right? It's a finite resource, and it's just simply formed from old prehistoric vegetation. So hundreds of millions of years ago, the vegetation dies, decomposes, gets buried under sediments, and over time, as it is subject to heat and pressure, it changes from vegetation into peat, into various grades of coal. And this is an important diagram because it illustrates the different grades of coal, from peat in the top left-hand corner to anthracite in the bottom right-hand corner, right? So coal forms from the conversion of this plant material into peat. And as you keep subjecting it to heat and pressure, it changes into anthracite. As you move down that spectrum, everybody, the amount of water decreases, the amount of volatile, bad, ugly stuff decreases, and the carbon content increases, right? So the bottom line is the coal gets better. You get a higher amount of energy per pound of coal that you burn. You produce less volatile stuff like mercury, right? Your coal, quote unquote, gets cleaner as you move from peat to anthracite, right? So there are various grades of coal. Lignite is very, very poor, dirty coal. Subbituminous is better. Bituminous is a little better. Anthracite is the best quality coal. So here's a map of the coal-bearing areas of the United States. What do you notice on this? You're looking at anthracite in black, bituminous in blue, subbituminous in that light blue, and then lignite in the very lightish colors here.
We mostly extract bituminous coal.
Yeah, tricky, right? Most of it is bituminous or subbituminous coal, okay? So you've got huge areas of bituminous coal over here, obviously up through the Appalachians, right? And down here, okay? And here's Wyoming. Why am I pointing out Wyoming? Here's the Powder River Basin in Wyoming. This is a huge deposit of subbituminous coal. You know where a lot of that coal goes? Right here, Texas, okay? Most of our coal-fired power plants lie along this axis here, from southwest of Waco to northeast Tyler and Longview, right? I sometimes refer to this as the Wall of Fire. Okay? It sounds like a scene out of Finding Nemo. The Wall of Fire from Waco to Longview. This is where a lot of the pollution is, okay? And you can see that these deposits here, this is lignite. This is why most of the coal plants were built here along these old lignite deposits, right? But now we're importing a lot of our coal from Wyoming. Even though coal's on the way out, we're still bringing it in. All right. Problematic here is the next one. Let me just clear that. Here's one of the problems. 1/3 of all of that coal that you see, we can get by strip mining, by surface mining. If you're a coal operator, this is great because it's the least expensive way of getting coal, right? You just scrape off the surface and you get to the coal seam close. So it's the most cost-effective way to get at coal through surface mining or strip mining. In the Appalachian Mountains, here's another way of getting at coal. This is called mountaintop removal, okay? What a novel technique. You remove the mountaintop to get to the coal seam, right? So you can see there's areas in the distance here that are all showing mountaintop removal. I had never personally appreciated the scale of mountaintop removal until I flew from DFW to Washington 1 year, and we flew over the Appalachians, right? Remember, I posed that question really early on in the course, everybody. Does the coal company have an ethical responsibility to put this mountain back? Oh, and what about all the stuff that's running off this mountain, like the mine tailings and the sulfur and the arsenic that are getting into our watershed? Unknown. The bottom line with coal, and here I'm going to just give you my opinion, right? For me, when it comes to energy, it's anything but coal. And that's just my opinion, right? And here's one of the reasons. Again, folks, I'm never going to, in an exam, ask you to remember how many thousands of tons of sulfur dioxide come out of a coal-fired power plant. Far too detailed. The point here is that as you read through these bullet points and you look at the range of environmental things that come off coal, whether it's atmospheric, sulfur dioxide, that gets into the atmosphere of acid rain, nitrogen dioxide, a major component of tropospheric ozone that we're going to talk about later on, small particles, hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide. The list goes on and on and on, right? So the environmental impacts of coal are profound, okay? And so for me, I'm an ABC guy, anything but coal, right? My environmental friends hate the fact that I published a paper supporting natural gas and fracking if it's done responsibly. They thought I should be excommunicated from the environmental community. So then you ask them, okay, if it's not going to be natural gas, what's it going to be, right? Well, we got to go 100% nuclear. Well, that's tricky. Economically, that doesn't work. So that's where this conversation about energy, I think, has to be grounded in reality. And here's part of that grounding, right? Coal is here to stay for some time to come, internationally at least. And here's why. take a look at this diagram here. This is an extraordinary diagram that shows the big three: the US, China, and India, right? In terms of coal. Just look at this for the moment, right? Up at the top here, you'll see the number of operating coal-fired power plants in terms of megawatts, right? So these megawatts is a unit of power. And I'll explain megawatts when we start getting to renewable energy in a bit more detail. But just look at the reality here, everybody. The US currently has 175,000 megawatts of power being produced from coal. There are no coal-fired power plants under construction in the US and no coal-fired power plants under construction or planned in the United States, right? Take a look at China and India, right? And how that plays out in these two remarkable countries. China has almost 1 million megawatts of coal. And you can just look at the map here, right? The colors here show operating, planned, and under construction, right? India has more coal-fired power plants than the United States. Look at China's under construction and planned, right? The planned coal-fired power plants and those that are under construction in China at the moment add up to all the power plants in the United States, right? That's why coal's not going away. China gets 65% of its electricity from coal. Think about that, 65%, right? They're not going to switch that on off overnight, right? So coal's here to stay for quite some time. Now, that is not to say that China isn't decarbonizing their electricity, and that's a discussion we'll have towards the end of next week, right? Now, I'm sure you've read about or heard about how this plays out in terms of air quality, right? China realizes that the pollution from coal in terms of sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, and carbon dioxide, it's an enormous health hazard, right? It's a health problem. Here's an interesting side-by-side photograph of coal. This is Beijing in 2008 in the left and Beijing in 2013 in the right. Same view. Why did I put up 2008 here, do you think, for Beijing?
Did they have the Olympics?
It was, yeah, the 2008 Olympics, right? And the Chinese government thought, you know, I don't think people are going to want to come to the Olympics and have polluted air. So they basically almost shut down industry. They banned most cars from Beijing. They shut down the coal-fired power plants. Magically, the air quality improved, right? And then starts going downhill post-Olympics.
Didn't air quality like get better whenever China shut down during the COVID outbreak?
So great question. I'm going to talk about that when it comes to air pollution and to climate change, right? COVID's had a remarkable impact on air quality. Nice observation, Holly. We'll see that as well in the Central Valleys of California. We saw it in Paris, Madrid, and so on, right? Again, not that I would advocate for a pandemic to clean up the atmosphere, but there was certainly a benefit there, right? Here's my final slide on coal, and I've gone through this pretty quickly, right? But I think you get a sense that I'm just not a big fan of coal. The real cost of coal isn't just, you know, air quality, right? The real cost comes to human health, okay? Black lung disease. A question from Shandy, do seasons have any effect on air quality? Absolutely, they do. If you wouldn't mind just parking that until we talk about the atmosphere after exam one. Sharidi, we'll get to that. But the real cost of coal on the environment, on human health, on ecosystems has been enormous, right? It's been catastrophic. And you may have heard of this term clean coal. It's a myth. It doesn't exist. There's cleaner coal. Anthracite is cleaner, right? But when you look at the map of the United States, so little coal is anthracite that we have to move away from coal, okay? Courtney, does China produce more coal or import more? It produces, okay? And it's exporting. It's exporting its carbon footprint to countries in Africa that have never really had a coal footprint. It's also importing huge amounts from Australia. It's a big coal exporter. So it does both, right? Okay, woo! That's context and that's coal. As always, I'm going to hang around in case there are other questions. Next, we'll do petroleum and natural gas. That'll be our discussion on Thursday. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's see, stop.